I want to talk a little bit about the Praxis, because I really like the Praxis. So, we have this faction in Fire and Time, but in particular in Time, that is just filled with glorious nerds. They are the mages of the Praxis Arcanum, and at their leader we have Talir. The Praxis Arcanum are the people who hang out in the desert and play around with dinosaurs. They have weird fire magic, and in cards like Hipshot we see that they have no idea how to use it and actually look cool. They fiddle around with bugs and weird experiments. They basically just try to explore magic in all of its forms, and to that extent I think that these guys are the guys who are going to save the world. When we are looking at the events of Eternal, we have Roland looking around through Argenport doing silly things and trying to take control of a city. We have Caleb and Vara questing for various different personal goals. We have Eileen trying to figure out whether she belongs with the clans or with herself. And the only person who is really focused on the problem of the Dusk Road is Talir, because Talir is a geek, and she likes to study things and find out interesting things about the world. So when weird stuff starts happening with the Shadowlands, when strangers start appearing in the void and just like showing up out of nowhere everywhere, Talir is the one who is exploring this problem and trying to figure out what's going on. And Talir comes up with an interesting thing related to the Shadowlands expansion. As night begins to fall harder, as we start to see the expansion of the Shadowlands into the Mirian world, Talir is the one who says, hey, these Waystones actually repel the shadow. Is it possible that as giant super nerds, we can use these? Could we perhaps invoke the Waystones? Go ahead and get that to the right size. Okay. This one's a hefty machine. So, 6 and 4-time influence. Invoke the Waystones. Discard the top 4 cards of your deck, then play the top card of your deck. Create and draw a copy of Invoke the Waystones with its cost increased by 1. This is a spell that you can play until you die. Invoke the Waystones can be safely played approximately 10 times with no difficulties whatsoever, but the one limiting factor on the card is that it discards so many cards off of your deck that you will eventually run out of time. Nonetheless, it is a really interesting machine, and it is doing a lot of things, both random and not random, that should be of interest to people who are playing around with this card. So, let's talk a little bit about what this card does. First off, it plays a card off the top of your deck for free. It doesn't play a card that you choose off the top of your deck. In fact, it tries very, very hard to play a card that you did not choose off the top of your deck. It is a random card, but that card could be any number of very silly, expensive things in any number of very silly, expensive colors. You can play Aid of the Huru or Spirit of Resistance off the top of your deck. You can play Scourge of Frostholm and Channel the Tempest and all sorts of incredibly dumb things if you choose to build your deck as just glorious, glorious jank. And that's already quite appealing. There are also decks in which this card belongs that are much more competitive, like Combre ramp-style decks that are playing around with self-mill. So, for example, if you are playing with Ephemeral Wisp, the card that plays out of your void, or Dawnwalker, or Privilege of Rank, all cards that really, really like to be discarded, then Invoke the Waystones is extremely powerful in that respect, because it can mill a sizable amount of cards, and then also play a big unit to bring those cards back. You can get yourself some Dawnwalkers in the Void and play a Sandstorm Titan out of Invoke the Waystones. You can get yourself a large amount of other things. Like, basically, you can do all sorts of ridiculous things with this card. And the most important thing about it in a ramp-style deck is that it does not cost you any card advantage, because you will always redraw a new copy of Invoke the Waystones. In Xenon, you have the ability to play all sorts of self-milling effects like Sporefolk and Grasping at Shadows, and play with Void Recursion. And if you're playing Invoke the Waystones, you're pretty likely to get a lot of that all at once. Imagine Invoke the Waystones directly into Avara. That's going to get you a bunch of cards in Shadow into your Void, and then the ability to pull those specifically out of your Void. Invoke the Waystones activates any type of Void Recursion or Void cards that care about the Void. Specifically, Moment of Creation, the spell-loving card that really wants you to have spells in your Void. Stone Scar Excavator, the discard to deal damage equal to the number of lands in your Void. And one of my absolute favorites, we finally have some way to play Forgotten Find, the 2-cost card that plays power out of your Void. I think all of those are really, really interesting. If Invoke the Waystones, if you're in a stall state and you're just playing power off the top of your deck with Invoke the Waystones, that's totally fine, because the power means that you can just play Invoke the Waystones again next turn, and that's really interesting for any deck that wants to get to the sort of big things that it wants to play off Invoke the Waystones. It is 4 time, so that's an influence requirement that's pretty hard to beat, or pretty hard to meet, but it is also in time, and that is the easiest possible faction to get 4 time in. Basically, any type of deck that wants 4 influence in a particular color, time is the best way to do that. We have Amber Acolytes, we have Secret Pages, we have Find the Way, we have Forgotten Find, of course. We have so many different ways to get that influence going, in time in particular, the color of Fixing, that this is actually a card that can be played in 2-color decks fairly easily. I wouldn't say 3-color decks is going to be a great time, but you can certainly try and manage it, and at least Invoke the Waystones can play those cards that you don't have the influence for if it gets them off of the top. Now, I tried to think of good ways to control the top 4 cards of your deck. There isn't really much. You can Second Sight, Excavate, 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 Invoke the Waystones, and get the card that you want. But beyond that, at the moment, there's no way to figure out exactly what you want to do with Invoke. So it's not terribly likely to get you a lot of value out of that. It doesn't play at all with Revenge, because you really don't need to play a Revenge card off the top, and milling cards definitely doesn't work out for you. So probably wouldn't want to run it in a deck like that. But you can use it to discard a lot of cards for Void Recursion, and that's really something that's quite special. I think Invoke the Waystones works especially well with Excavate, because it does allow you to pick up a really sizable amount of card advantage and then pick particular cards out of your Void to handle particular problems. So it's a card that really behaves well with that, because the ceiling on this card is essentially infinite. Well, it's, you know, it's about 12 casts and then you're dead, but it's still pretty close to infinite in terms of the amount of value that it offers. This card does not incur card disadvantage ever. It will always play a card for 6. Whether that card is good or not depends on how heavy your deck is and what it is that you're playing around with. You can certainly do things to manipulate the contents of your deck, like New Tomorrow and other delightful jank. I love that kind of jank, and I think that Invoke the Waystones is really, really interesting in that respect. But yeah, like, overall, this card seems pretty good to me. Like, as a jank card, or as a shenanigans card, I'm very, very excited for it. But just as a general sort of control type card in like big, beefy Combre decks, I think this might have a place. Like, I think there's a possibility that this card is doing enough things similar to, say, Seraph, or basically any sort of card that has that amount of infinite value at the end of your game, that it's actually going to be doing pretty good things in big time decks, and big time decks are happy to have another card that offers them just infinite amounts of value. Now, if you want to do maximum style of jank, someone's mentioning it exactly as I was thinking, Nesting Avasor is a way to reduce the cost of Invoke the Waystones, such that you can play it cheaper and cheaper and continue to play it multiple times. I also think it's really fun to give this card Echo, because then it just draws copies of itself until you eventually have to discard those copies because it is just too much stuff that you can play. But it also allows you to offset that cost disadvantage in a way that's pretty effective. Someone's mentioning the Library Phoenix as a way to make Invoke the Waystones cheaper. Yep, that's one way to do it. Trail Stories is certainly probably a very good route because, of course, while Trail Stories incurs negative card advantage, Invoke the Waystones is infinite advantage once again. However, Trail Stories plus Invoke the Waystones could lead to an Invoke the Waystones into a Trail Stories, which I don't think is going to work terribly well in your favor. I'm not even sure that you would be able to Trail Stories the copy of Invoke the Waystones. For means to an end type decks, this is certainly an extra way to discard cards. Life Force is going to do probably a better job for you, but Invoke the Waystones is certainly doing some work there, so you can actually have a little bit of fun with that. It definitely does enable sort of the larger graveyard combo, so if you want to do the Infernal Tyrant combo, which we have not yet built a deck around, that is something that Invoke can kind of help out with. Yeah. You give Invoke the Waystones Destiny, it will deck you out. I don't know if there is a way to give Invoke the Waystones Destiny yet, but yeah, that card is ridiculous. Oh, and the one other card that we haven't mentioned that Invoke the Waystones is really, really good with, and should be played with, in fact, is Temporal Distortion. At 8 cost, Temporal Distortion allows you to play Invoke the Waystones twice every turn. That means that you are playing a card every turn that is just going to, like, basically increase the speed of your board to a pretty ridiculous extent. This card can fill your board up and give you a really sizable amount of advantage over your opponent if you are playing it twice. And to the extent that these decks can ramp with Privilege of Rank and other interesting cards, to the extent that they can play power themselves to continue to play out stuff well, like, yeah, this will win you the game in just a couple of turns if you have it down with Temporal Distortion, which is good because eventually it will kill you. So we know that it is 4 cards plus the 5th, and yeah, about 10 times is probably your maximum as far as that goes. If you can find some way to shuffle your deck back or shuffle your void back, it might be that that card exists now. We don't know for sure. Any way to offset that drawback could be really interesting because the potential for shenanigans is somewhat limited by that. But I do think that overall, it's a great card. So yeah, that is Invoke the Waystones. And we can see here that Talir has cut herself off a chunk of such Waystones and is using it to repel the shadow. Yeah, I am absolutely delighted by this card. I cannot wait to see the new Talir. I suspect that she is going to be a Praxis card, but I don't know for sure. I think that she will probably play well with Temporal Distortion and Invoke, and Invoke will be able to play her quite a lot if she is in fact an 8-drop. So pretty sick. And I'm very excited for this card. It will often exist more as a 1 of or a 2 of in particular control decks because it is just an infinite source of card advantage, and you don't really need to stack this card up to make it be really good. This is a card that you can pick out just 1 of with Celestial Omen at the top of your curve and be like, okay, well now I can just play everything else in my deck whenever I want to with just this 1 card. That's a pretty reasonable way to go about things. And, you know, if you can definitely like reduce it, then that's pretty good. So that is it for the spoiler breakdown for me. Thank you so much for watching, you YouTube folks. I will see you all next time with more Eternal stuff, brews and spoilers and all of the like. Cheers to you.